Karthikeyan Nachiyappan. He is an architect who has graduated from the Architectural Association. His research has been published in many esteemed journals, such as the Indian Concrete Journal. He is the founder and director of Studio of Architectural Urbanism, an art and architecture consultancy focusing on research and development of housing projects in Ooty and in Chennai. His research interests include low-cost housing, architectural space making, informality and slums, inequalities in planning, and policies and urban design.
Welcome to UGC lecture series on architecture, urban design, unit number 2, lecture number 1. For your understanding and convenience, the lecture has been composed into parts. Come, let's take a look at what are the components of the study today. So, we will be understanding the morphology of cities. So, cities have been growing constantly. So, we will look at how cities have been formed spatially from the ancient civilizations till modern cities which have had or seen growth post industrialization. This comes to a conclusion on, or a question to ponder upon, on what was our first city. Does anyone know which is the first city evolved in hundreds and hundreds of years ago, or say thousands of years ago, in what civilization? So, which means that all cities attest to imposition of a geometrically ordered streets. So, even before we don't know the names of the cities which have been evolved before, we know that all our prehistoric ancestors have implied or imposed simple geometrical shapes and patterns in the formation of cities. And let us take series of looks on how the cities have been spatially evolved from prehistoric till industrial evolution. One of the Fertile Crescent, which is otherwise known as the Babylonian or the Sumerian civilization, led to the growth of one of the ancient cities called Ur. So, this city of Ur is an otherwise in modern day Middle Eastern countries, the city of Ur, which has a compound, which has a fortification around it, which has a series of moats as a protective measure, and there are bastions on either sides of it which marks the entry to this particular area, and there is also an artificial harbor for the entire city. So, which means that the city has been organized into two different landforms, one having a bigger or a large landmass and the other having a smaller landmass, which means that the ancient cities should have followed a particular measure of a huge city state which has the political and administrative authorities in the center, followed by a group of residential, commercial and marketplaces on the other side. So, to support these marketplaces and trades, there is a small harbor which leads or drains down at the end of this political and residential quarters, and this harbor eventually drains off into the local streams or the river Euphrates and Tigris. The first cities have shown evidence of straight streets in an ordered and patterned manner, and there have also been series of hierarchies followed in the street pattern, which means that there were also segregation of the vehicular roads as well as pedestrian streets. In this image, you could look at the domination of an urban square which has the ziggurat in the city state of Ur, which is dominant religious institution, followed by a series of political and administrative buildings surrounding it, and these buildings are made of the locally made materials, and these are monoliths dominating the cityscape, and eventually this outside the fortification has a series of residential quarters as well. The plan or the morphology of the city state has been evolved organically, and a simple representation of the city of Ur or the Babylonian city expresses more growth towards northwestern part of it, which means the fortification has been followed in the northwestern provinces, for having a ziggurat at the center and the political and administrative quarters in and around the fortifications. Outside the fortification, the city is organically grown, and you can see a parts and traces of residential areas outside the fortification. So, simply cities have exhibited two different morphologies, one with a smaller scale of growth which represents the residential quarter, and one with a larger growth which represents the fortification or the political quarters. Looking at the layout of Dholavira, so which means that we were talking about prehistoric and ancient civilizations in different countries and different states following similar patterns or geometries of growth. So, we had looked at a Middle Eastern civilization. Now, looking at our own civilization in India, which is close to Harappa and Mohenjo-daro civilization, the layout of Dholavira exists a simple geometrical layout which is juxtaposed on a contour land. So, you could see the topography which is more or less like a contour, and this geometrically driven layout is just imposed on top of it. So, the city is basically composed into two towns. One would be the lower town, which is more towards the northeastern quarter, and one towards the middle town. So, which has the citadel, the bailey and the castle towards, and there is also a ceremonial ground for celebrations, parade and everything. So, in this case, this entire domain of middle town, which includes the political and administrative quarters, holds granaries and all the administrative related buildings, and this close to the stream has more of the residential quarters, and it also has several gates which enters the city in different forms. And you could also see the layout of streets which follows a morphology of a gridiron pattern. This is one of the images taken at the excavation at Mohenjo-daro, which again simply implies a geometrical pattern or a shape which is being exhibited, and the existence of orthogonal grid like structures is also seen in these cases. And you could see a larger figure ground which might be the castle or the bailey or maybe the great bath, and these could be as the local building, I mean the administrative building supporting these quarters. And more you move towards the eastern corner, you could see traces of smaller residential quarters which could have been there. Moving into the context of Greek. So, now when cities grow, there are civilizations improve, there is a sense of individuality and communalism coming into factor. So, this sense of a community and group of people and public gathering or democracy started with the ages of Greek, where they started constructing or leaving spaces for the community called as agora. Agora is in another words is called as an open space. As you could see, these are a series of buildings which are enclustered around a single open space, and this Panathenaic way connects. So, in modern day Greece, the exact agora is down south or in exactly below the Acropolis hill. So, from the Acropolis you just take the Panathenaic way which cuts across the Greek agora and moves into the Dipylon. So, you have all the court buildings including the stoa and lot of religious buildings encompassing it, with this central forum which became eventually the most civic center of or the most happening place in the city. So, this is the place where the Greeks gather, this is the place where mass gathering or mass communal activities, protests and all kinds of people come and foster around these places. Now, this in turn has been exhibited in the Forum Romanum as well. So, Forum of the Rome is again another open space which is clustered around a group of buildings. So, this is an excavated image which is now present. So, you could see a series of buildings around the enclustered courtyard, and you can see series of walkways which are encircled around it. So, this is again a common space for gathering. So, Forum Romanum again was a place of spiritual, religious and civic centers. You could see people around like hucksters or people, I mean people including criminals to public who gather around these spaces for public. So, any mass gathering activities would take around these places. So, more than this being a common or a public space, this also involved a lot of temple or religious structures. So, this is one of the, at the west end, which is the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, and you could also see a lot of meeting places including the Crima and the Comitium. So, these are assembly buildings which support So, the meeting places does not encompass only meeting of public which is around an open courtyard right in front of the Comitium. It also encompasses a meeting place for the legislative assembly to happen. So, there are also hierarchy of open and closed meetings. Some of the open meetings happen around the courtyard around these places, and some of the internal meetings or the private meetings happen within the buildings. This is a reconstructed image of the west end of Roman Forum. So, which includes temples of Vespasian, Concordia and temple of Saturn, and a series of administrative buildings and archways. So, you could just look at the scale of the Roman Forum, which is inclusive of a human. So, it is immense in scale. So, which means that this is for a public, an individual sense of identity could not be felt in open spaces or gathering spaces. And this also comes to a fact that people built, I mean cities are composed of people, and all the people gather together to form a space in a city. Moving down to medieval cities. So, looking at these civilizations grow, the medieval towns of ancient Renaissance grow. There were simple characteristics of identification of medieval towns, which includes the center of the town was dominated by a central church, and this central church led to different series of streets that move organically or spread organically into different hierarchies of roads. the church plaza became the important market plaza that became the most happening place in a city, and you could see the cross sections of the buildings, a lot of cluster of activities happening inside the building as well as lot of clusters of activities happening outside the building. So, there is an in and out experience experienced in all the buildings. All the political and religious buildings are organized around the church plaza, and for protective measures, this was the entire settlement of medieval towns was organized in a landscape which was in a mountain or a ridge or a terrain. So, in terms of defensive measures, a hilly area could protect them in terms of uncertain issues. You could also see a castle. So, another dominant feature of a medieval city was a castle that is surrounded by a moat. So, this entire castle, outside the castle was a moat which again proved as a protective measure, and churches, hospitals, cathedrals, markets and housing also followed in and around the city's fortification wall. Now, these were mostly irregular streets. You could see a sense of scale where you enter a grandeur open space or a market area which drains down into narrow streets following. So, which means that hierarchy of pedestrian as well as vehicular circulation was followed in such cities. You could see hierarchies of vehicles moving along larger streets and these narrow streets entertaining only pedestrian routes. And moreover, for any enemy to invade these medieval towns, this irregularity of uncertainty of these streets led to more safer and protective neighborhoods. Now, another important aspect of growth of town after the 18th century was industrialization. Everyone knows, so we have seen the composition of cities, how it had been followed in the past years and the pre-civilizations. Now, the major city, in urban design context, we would be looking at how cities have grown. So, the boom of the city started after the boom of industrialization, advent of industries. So, industrialization and urbanization had led in the growth of cities. As immigration exploded, the urban population surged from around 6 million in 1860 to 42 million in 1910, which means that it has almost 6 times the growth of a particular population in just 5 decades. In late 19th centuries, industry invaded the entire city, which means that the predominant architecture of the prehistoric civilizations were spaces for the public and administrative buildings and religious buildings. Now, after the industries invaded, the city's morphology took a different shape. Come, let us take a look at some of the cities which have been evolved post industrialization. Now, this is a graphic image of what the cities were post World War and post industrialization. Now, you could see a lot of these chimneys going up as skylines. So, what dominated the skyline was these factories and warehouses. Now, you could see the narrow sense of streets widening up to accommodate a lot of heavy loading vehicles like trucks, cars and everything. So, motorization started coming into existence. The urban blocks shifted in a bigger character. The larger character of urban grains followed these entire city's morphology and eventually releasing smoke in terms of pollution to the cities. This is an interesting image of Dubai before and after. So, what you see as the image before is just 2 decades back, where the growth was in more or less like a desert, where you could see the landscape of the city with smaller desert forms dominating the skyline rather than these couple of buildings. Now, in just 2 decades, the advent of industrialization, the advent of motorization and globalization factors incorporated city to build or add density, which is in the form of skyscrapers. So, which means that what dominates the city is not more of a public space, rather than what dominates the city would be these skylines, would be these skylines as well as the roads. So, now where is the question becomes, where is the space for public to even breathe? Another ideal city concept was during the early Renaissance period by philosophers and sociologists. So, this is the early city of Palmyra, which was again a conceptual city where there is a central organization of an open space which is clustered around a dominant political building or a religious building. Now, the streets radiate into several directions, forming different urban blocks that leads into the bastions, and these bastions are externally protected through a moat, which is a water body in terms of defensive measures, and there is also a fortification wall which forms a kind of a star shape. So, in this, the advantage of the city is it is literally organized into a radial manner, and these concentric rings of roads support different uses. So, around the first courtyard could become most of the administrative buildings, and breathing spaces, and the remaining surrounding the fortification wall would be the residences. So, which means that an ideal city could have a safe walking neighborhood in advent of this. Now, looking into what the ideal city concept was, it is again following a similar pattern of Roman Forum, the Forum Romanum, where you exhibit a space similar for the public. The scale of the space with respect to the scale of human being is so huge, immense, but it follows a sense of order, hierarchy, harmony, and the city is built or composed of many public spaces in the central courtyard rather than the buildings dominating the skyline. So, any space of this sort involves public participation, and most of the ideal city concepts includes or incorporates the concept of moral, spiritual, religious, cultural and technological growth of all the cities. Now, this plan of these ideal cities followed the gridiron pattern as such. Now, gridiron, this eventually evolves from the ancient concept of the plan of Piraeus, where otherwise called as Hippodamian plan. So, Hippodamus, a Greek philosopher, invented this gridiron pattern in Piraeus, or a coastal city in Greece. So, this is the coast which includes the Piraeus harbor, and this is the shoreline. Now, a city eventually developed which is a coastal city. So, he had clearly or cleverly incorporated this gridiron plan with A, B and C. These are temples or religiously important buildings marking the same urban block, where other urban blocks were equally divided, equally or partially equally divided into a gridiron pattern. So, these intersect orthogonally at right angles. It has a plus kind of formation, and this has been exhibited throughout the neighborhood. So, now 2000 years later, after the plan of Piraeus, came up William Penn in 1862, the formation of Philadelphia, which is again a gridiron pattern. So, you could see a centrally dominated building, but the question over here was every plot of land is essentially equal to every other. So, a sense of equality is formed in terms of formation of towns and cities, and eventually a natural resource like a water body supports the same. So, cities could grow in every sector. So, every sector or parcels of land was equally divided. So, a lot happened over the next 2000 years when William Penn started designing these plans. Now, this gridiron pattern has been exhibited in more or less other city states of America, including Manhattan. Now, so the basic concept to start with of the gridiron plan was be sure to settle the figure to the town so as that the streets hereafter may be uniform down to the water from the country bounds, which means that he says from a countryside to a town, make it equal. Equality plays a very important role. Everything should be same. A rural area and urban area should not be distinguished in terms of the size and shape of the sectors. This may be ordered when I come, only let the houses built be in a line or upon line as much as may be, which means that build beyond, don't build beyond the boundaries. A certain series of regulations should be followed within the country's development. So, which eventually led to formation of gridiron pattern or orthogonally intersecting streets and the indexial pattern or organizing streets in numbers. So, in today's modern world, we call street numbers and street wards like street number 1, main road 1, and all these have been the indexial patterns which exhibited in the modern plans of Philadelphia and Manhattan. So, William Penn attributed these sectors with giving plot numbers to every street and sector numbers to every plot of area, and that has been indexed quality as 1, 7 and numbered. So, this made easy for everyone to understand the sense of place, and as you could see in the image, parcels of land are equally subdivided, and within the parcels of land there are again subdivisions of land which could be subletted or subdivided into residential commodities. So, what you see below is a master plan of Manhattan which eventually developed with series of open spaces here and there dominating the skyline, but the remaining having a similar gridiron pattern, where when it comes close to this becomes a dense figure ground. Another concept of it was city industrial, which is again a city state, where Tony Garnier invented this concept of a city industrial, basically subdividing the zoning into 4 phases. So, he had given work, leisure, business and commercial should be separated, so as well as health. So, he has given a set of series of healthcare centers in and around the surrounding suburban areas where the residential development has to happen, and segregated the old town and which is close to the station. So, this railway station transits the people, helps them move or have an intra-connectivity between other cities, and lot of electric power stations and services has been ordered across the northeastern corner of the city state, and industries have been cleverly demarcated. So, you could see a rail edge which splits the zoning into an industrial part, into a residential category, into a healthcare category and the old town. And for more convenience, this old town has been subdivided into 3 phases, which includes the public spaces and including the assembly and legislative furnitures. So, the region of the station in center of the city includes the most important central business district, or it has all the public facilities dominated by a skyline which becomes a landmark for the entire cityscape, and all these buildings form the commercial aspect as a city square. And this Tony Garnier's plan, even though it was just conceptualized, it was not realized, but it became a predecessor for a lot of other major planners or philosophical planners, including Le Corbusier, to exhibit his plan of wheel radius. Moving to wheel radius, which is again another concept, an utopian plan developed by architect Le Corbusier, where he designs the entire city into equal, it is derived from tabula rasa, where all the buildings have been divided into Cartesian grid form. So, the entire morphology of this is dominated by the skyline of the central buildings, which are around 200 meters high, elevated around a podium, and the supporting surrounding amenities of residences, commercial, business districts, parks and everything follow a similar pattern, leading or pouring down into this central area. For his convenience, the plan was more formulated from tabula rasa and it followed a Cartesian grid like arrangement. So, you could see the formation of grids exhibited in and everywhere at different scales in the plan. So, the center of it, he mostly concentrated on the central area, which is the central business district, or it houses 200-meter high towers, which slowly gets down into commercial district. So, eventually the central plaza became the house for more civic buildings, more public buildings and as legislative buildings, and slowly moving down south and the north, it has more residential quarters, where the capital complex is followed by a central park is dominating the northern part, and the southern residences eventually lead down to the corner of the site, where the exit of this are mostly dominated by industrial skyline. So, even though this city was conceptualized in terms of a gridiron pattern, it had lot of criticisms, and eventually wheel radius was not, or the radiant city was not exhibited as such in real, but the entire plan of this was to demolish a vernacular European city and clear the grid so that this new plan could be exhibited. Even though this is an unrealized plan, but certain concepts was criticized and things could be taken forward. Moving to traditional planning strategies in India, and just a forelook on the modern city Chandigarh, which was again planned by architect Le Corbusier based on different concepts of the modular man and tabula rasa. So, now India was split and Punjab needed a state capital. This state capital was asked to be designed by great architects and urban planners. So, out of which was Le Corbusier's plan, but before which the concepts of Le Corbusier included well intended utopian vision for the city and the city as a whole. Now, the two major reasons of this existence of the city was trust in terms of technology, and this technology could exhibit a mass production or mass scaling of that particular city. Now, even though the city was ideally designed, it was uncompromising on the ideas of modernist rules and principles that had to be exhibited, or that is what the capital state needed. So, the modernist utopian ideas have been exhibited in the city state. So, even before Corbusier design, a fan like design was exhibited by Albert Mayer as a competition project, where the capital complex, high court and the legislative buildings up in the north, which eventually flows down in the series of fan like radiating roads, where the cities are dominated by super blocks which are exhibited between the yellow lines, and the central green park flowing in and around the sites dominating it, and the central building again dominates a sector. Most of the commercial buildings align around it and the residential buildings are down south. So, it is again complemented by a city center, government facilities surrounding it, residences and industry going down south along the corridor. The Chandigarh plan of Le Corbusier exhibited the same in terms of sectoring. So, it followed a gridiron pattern where it started with the Capitol Complex Legislative Assembly and the Rocket Garden, which is in the modern context in sector number 1, 2 and 3, eventually flowed down to the Capitol Complex and legislative buildings, and some of these sectors are split into government buildings. Now, other sectors have been formed in terms of a sector size of 800 by 1200 meters, 800 by 1200, and every street has a corner roundabout to regulate the traffic. Another important part of this Corbusier's plan was hierarchicalizing roads. So, there were different government facilities, residences and industries around it, and the industries were pushed towards the south along the arterial roads. Now, the hierarchies of the streets followed includes the major arterial road, which was the V1 road, which is in the highway. V2 are the major boulevards in and around the sectors. V3 are the sector defenses, which you could see over here. The borders of the sectors are the V3 roads. Once you enter the major shopping streets around the sector, the cross axial line is the V4. V5 are neighborhood streets which radiate around this particular neighborhoods. V6 are access lanes and V7 are pedestrian paths or the cul-de-sacs, which are the internal streets, and V8 are cycle tracks around the sectors which are followed. So, which means that he has cleverly organized the hierarchies of streets according to the vehicles moving till the pedestrian. So, the major trucks and lorries could work in V1 roads, whereas a car could work on a V3 or a V4 road, and cyclists could work on a much narrower lanes, and pedestrian could work on a narrower path, that is a cul-de-sac road. More than this, the secretariat and the legislative assemblies were designed, which exhibits the brutal plan of Corbusier, which is being exclusively exhibited in terms of architecture. This also helps one person understand that urban design is not about designing cities, but it also includes the design of every smaller detail with respect or in proportion to the entire city. Some of the traditional ancient settlements include the city of Madurai. Just to wrap up, so ancient planning concepts in India were again temple towns. So, again the temple town of Madurai, which has the Vaigai river down south, which has the focal point as the temple in the center, and it developed around concentric ring of roads, and the ancient fortifications split the town from the Vaigai river, and it still has a series of canals. So, city developed around the temple as we were talking as a focal point, and the major roads are concentrated as the concentric ring roads surrounding the temples, the red ones, and the secondary important roads are the cross axial or the perpendicular roads that drive you into the entrance of the temple. But as you could see, beyond the black line or the boundary line of the old city of Madurai, the historic boundary closes and there is an unorganized settlement of residential neighborhoods in modern days. All these streets are cleverly organized, and beyond these the patterns of growth are not exhibited, and the width of the street increases or decreases in proportion as you move out of the major town center, and there are even much narrower streets or like walking alleys which exhibit up to a width of 0.6 meters. The city of Mughals, well planned and city of Mughals are exhibited in northern India, where it has predominance of the locally available materials and taking in climatic considerations as well. So, now everything was brought down into a single fort by the Mughals, where all these complexes, government officials, residences, political quarters, religious quarters were designed as one single entity with lot of public spaces following temple tanks and private gardens. Mughal gardens are another important aspect or important part of the planning of Mughal architecture. Now, again this also formed the basic concepts of simple shapes of buildings organized around central open spaces. So, again the climate played a very important role, and within these grids you could see grids of smaller scale and bigger scales, where these bigger scale grids are open courtyards which accommodates public gatherings, and these closed courtyards includes private spaces within the building. The last part of it includes colonialism, where it could be clearly explained. Colonialism is the establishment, exploitation, maintenance and acquisition and expansion of a particular colony in one territory, which is run by another political or another power from another territory. So, one early example was establishment of East India, which started growth of cities in and around India, and East India Company expanded all around India, creating railroads, and one such establishment was the city of Madras, which is again divided along the river, the Adyar river and the Buckingham Canal, and you could see the island grounds as part of it. So, you could see the black town and the white town, which are cleverly segregated in modern day Chennai with a wall tax road running across it. So, these people, while planning, orthodoxly created a plan which had white town, which had the people or the settlers or the colonies of the British, and the other non-European and non-Christian parts of it were segregated in the black town, which was otherwise called as the Madras or Madrasapatnam. So, the planning started organizing itself in a radial manner, where the city center started from the Bay of Bengal, from the coast as it, and radiated north south and radiated east west as well. And lot of other settlements from Veperi, Egmore, Nungambakam and Triplicane, Mylapore started organizing itself, taking predominant importance. And after 1900s, city came into a domination aspect, where people started building residences more, and more industries came into exploitation of all these spaces, creating Madras an important historic town in the case of East India Company. Slowly, railways started exploiting itself. Growth of railways has led to mass industrialization, and more job opportunities has let Madras grow into different dimensions and different qualities, and lot of landscapes in Madras now surround the entire townscape. Now, looking at all these examples from the ancient to the modern civilization, what could be a way forward for the city becomes a question. So, achieving this could be a sustainable city concept or a smart city concept, which many urban planning authorities are trying to do it. We could look at more of urban spatial theories and policies and more about urban design in the forthcoming lecture series. So, before that, let us summarize. So, we had looked at what ancient cities have grown around the Roman Forum and open spaces, and the medieval towns, which has resulted in two different kinds of cities, and post industrialization as well. So, these are some questions for you to understand and exploit on. So, let us take a look at other series on urban design in the forthcoming lectures. Thank you.